Human trafficking is a term we hear everywhere, in headlines, on social media, and whispered through our communities. But how much do we really understand about what it is, who it impacts, and how to respond? I'm Miko Anderson, and this is the Traffic Report, a podcast from Equitas. This season, we'll sit down with survivors, prosecutors, advocates, and allies, not only to uncover the impact of human trafficking, but to focus on what comes next, the strategies, reforms, and community-driven solutions survivors need from us. We'll look at where systems fall short, and we'll highlight the innovations that practitioners are building to make support safer, stronger, and sustainable. Together, we'll explore what it takes to create real and lasting change. When we talk about human trafficking, we often focus on the moment of crisis or when the case is prosecuted. But the story doesn't end there. Many survivors face the most vulnerable moments during transition. That's aging out of foster care, being discharged from programs, or leaving a shelter or a hospital. These predictable transition points can leave them exposed and open to exploitation again. Often, these transitions are managed by different agencies with little coordination. Even when well-meaning people are involved, gaps in communication and planning can mean the system ghosts survivors. And that's when the survivor needs the system most. Today, we're looking at how agencies can step up, designate liaisons, focus on the financial impact of exploitation, and document practices that actually work to keep survivors safe during these critical moments. To help us unpack this, we'll hear from Bekah Charleston, who has lived experience and knows firsthand the challenges of navigating these transitions. Bekah is a nationally recognized advocate and speaker. She's been featured by NPR, USA Today, The New York Post, and more. She's a survivor who turns a decade of exploitation into a career fighting for change. She's the founder of Bekah Speaks Out, where she trains and consults with leaders nationwide. She's also a key advocate for the Trafficking Survivors Relief Act and plaintiff in a federal lawsuit that challenges Nevada's legalized prostitution industry. She's a former nonprofit executive director providing emergency services, housing, and advocacy for survivors, and a TEDx speaker and national engagement specialist for the Sex Trade Survivors Caucus. She received the presidential pardon in 2020 for crimes committed under coercion, symbolizing justice and hope.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me, Miko.
Bekah, can you start by sharing what transition meant for you in your own journey after leaving programs and a support system?
Sure. Yeah, transition for me, what I learned was physical freedom doesn't equal emotional or mental freedom. And while I made the brave decision to run from my previous trafficking experience in that situation that I had been in for a decade, I was terrified, honestly. I mean, I was starting over, not from scratch, but from less than scratch. I really honestly still blamed myself for what had happened to me. I felt like I made bad choices and I got what I deserved. And I really didn't have compassion on myself until I got pregnant. And that was, for me, the ultimate wake-up call, that I was willing to kind of reach out and begin asking safe people for help, because I knew that I didn't want a day of my baby's future to look anything like my past. And so I was finally willing to try something new. And thankfully, I had a family that I reached out to. And while they didn't give me much financial support at all, they did give me a free place to stay. And so I was 30 years old and 4 months pregnant and had $1 million of debt in my name due to my trafficker and the financial exploitation that occurred. And so it was terrifying, honestly, though. It was the first time for me in my life that I didn't have someone telling me who I was going to be and the choices that I was going to make. My traffickers had controlled every facet of my life. And I remember being overwhelmed by all the unknowns, overwhelmed by what if obviously as an about to be mom, I was contemplating like, how am I going to be able to support myself and my child without running out to try to find a man to help me, right? Because that obviously hadn't worked out too well for me up until that point. And um, it seemed like, maybe there should have been a lot of choices, but because of my past, there was actually really limited amount of choices. And thankfully, I was able to have a free place to stay, though, and I decided to go back to school. And I started reaching out for services. I am grateful that I was met by a community of people that really wrapped their arms around me and saw something inside me that I didn't believe existed. I didn't go into a residential housing program because, like I said, I was lucky to have a family that provided safe and free, stable housing for me during those early years of my recovery. But the services I did need and I did utilize obviously trauma-informed care that looked like, meeting a group of women, in that case, these volunteers at this nonprofit that I went to called Valiant Hearts. That was one of the first places that I received specialized services for what I had been through. And they provided services that look like weekly support group that I could show up to and received a gas card every single time I showed up, as well as a free hot meal and usually enough food leftovers to take home, even if I wanted to. It looked like, this group of volunteers that had never shared any of my experiences, but that stood in the gap and were willing to be a positive and supportive person in my life, whether they saw me again or not, and that was hard to accept at first, I think, as a survivor, when you get out and you start to receive services, because where I come from, people don't do things for you for nothing in return. People just take whatever they want from you. But here were these people that were the literal opposite of that, right? They never knew if they were going to see me again. They were feeding me, giving me clothes, providing financial assistance, support, helping me cover brands from my trafficker, sending me to my first national conference, which is where I got a taste for public speaking and being able to use my story to help other people. And so I'm grateful that I did have the supportive services that I needed to help me transition to becoming a leader.
When you work with survivors, because I know you do so much work in the field, when you work with survivors, if they don't have the benefit that you just explained with the family who helped you with housing, and you see that they still have those needs, how do you help them navigate the systems as they are and wherever they are located?
It could be difficult, especially there's certain barriers that reduce your housing possibility even more, like if you're pregnant, right? If you have a service animal that you really can't separate from, something that you want to take with you, that reduces your chances of, finding housing oftentimes. There can be a lot of other barriers that unfortunately make finding safe and stable housing really difficult. Thankfully, now we have the National Trafficking Sheltered Alliance, which if an organization is a partner with them, they're able to make one phone call to find housing, for example, instead of making 30 phone calls to 30 different safe homes across the country. They're able to just make one call, which saves a case manager, right, a lot of time, and also just finding out what beds are available. I mean, obviously, if you're a male victim of trafficking, there's only one organization right now. It's in the state of Texas that provides housing specifically for male youth and young adults that have been trafficked. Um, so I think we have a long way to go, to be honest.
And can I ask you, one of the things that I remember discussing with you, and I think we were at a national conference at the time, it was a phrase that you said that I had never heard before, but you talked about economic desperation.
Economic empowerment.
It was, and it was the reverse
Hmm.
side of that, and how a
Hmm.
lot of times that some survivors may need more than the limited opportunities that may be available by certain, organizations. A lot of times they can maybe speak and not be paid, enough to really sustain themselves, but to have the ability to have that economic empowerment. Can you talk about that and what you do in that field?
Where we are in 2025 in the anti-trafficking field, we haven't filled all the gaps and we haven't solved all the problems, but we do have restoration homes that do exist across the country. Um, what I'd like to see the gaps on the front end and the back end, right? That's what we're getting at right here, right? Right now we're talking about the back end. What does long-term sustainable success look like for survivors? But on that initial front end, oftentimes, you're sitting with someone that's in crisis. They may be detoxing from drugs, coming out of obviously a traumatic situation, and restoration homes do not take people in crisis. And there's a lot of good reasons for that. You don't want to destabilize the rest of the entire population at the facility because this individual is coming fresh out, obviously has some really raw and open wounds. They might need to go to detox, for example, first before they can go into a restoration center. That front end emergency stabilization, I don't think we're doing very well. But then also on that back end, so we have survivors that now have completed one, and maybe I know survivors that have completed multiple programs and that still aren't able to find a place to get on their feet. I think the economic empowerment initiatives, with my time while I was working at the Jensen Project, that was a big priority for me, was to push and try to advocate for funding for economic empowerment programs. Because if we pluck individual out of trafficking, hypothetically, we get the individual healed and hopefully in a more stable, emotionally, mentally, right, physical place. But then what? What comes after that? And far too often, I think we're not doing that piece well. There's a lot of organizations that have these kind of social entrepreneur type endeavors tied into their program. And I think those are very needed. And there's a huge place for those. It gives survivors skills of how to fail in the workplace, how to work in a safe environment. There's a lot of how to have a healthy relationship with authority, right? There's a lot of intangible skills that provides. But if we're not setting them up for a career in the real world, then what's going to happen after that program? What's the next step? The National Survivor Survey study that was recently published, I want to say in the last year or this year, it showed only 6% of survivors actually make $100,000 or more. And that number may or may not sound like a lot to you, because it honestly depends on what city you live in. Because if you're living in New York City, that number sounds a lot smaller than it does if you're living in Des Moines, Iowa, for example. And so, but what I took as the overall message of that is that only 6% out of 466 survivors, I want to say, that were studied, only 6% of them were really living like sustainable career, right, living wage opportunities. And I think that's a failure on our part, that we need to be equipping survivors with real skills on how to work in other industries. And we need to be partnering with those industries to be able to provide safe employment for survivors, and be willing to look past someone's past in order to give a qualified candidate for that role a chance.
When it comes to law enforcement or even prosecution, the specific role that those two systems have when it comes to their intersection with trafficking survivors, is there any impact that how they fulfill that role, carry out those duties? Is there any connection between that and the likelihood or, supporting the possibility for economic empowerment? Or are they just so far disconnected? Because a lot of times, and I'll tell you why I'm asking this question, a lot of times it seems like in the very beginning, when the crisis happens and the investigation is ongoing, ideas like economic empowerment and sustainable services seem so far away from what you're actually doing. Is there really any connection there, or are those two completely different phases of recovery?
I think it definitely creates, I think there definitely is a connection, especially with the criminal justice system and a survivor's likelihood of chances to reach that sustainable, right? Because once we get caught up in the criminal justice system, especially if we catch a solicitation or prostitution charge, that just makes our outcome exponentially harder than if we weren't caught up in the criminal justice system in the first place, if we weren't criminalized for the things that we were being forced to do. I know in the state of Texas, they've tried to create this statewide response that an individual is paired with a C-state advocate immediately, upon recovery or upon encounter with the system. And Sergeant Byron Fassett, he always said, when you pluck an individual out of trafficking, it creates a vacuum, and nature deplores a vacuum. And so if you don't immediately fill that vacuum with trust-based, positive, safe, and healthy relationships, an individual is always going to run back, right? Because I'm going to go back to something, as human beings, we're designed for connection, right? And even though my old connection was a negative, toxic, unhealthy connection, it was still a connection at the end of the day. And if I am now, like I said, terrified, I don't know how to navigate this new world, I'm trying to do something new, falling back to that familiar can be really enticing way too often. And so I think being able to using the system to ensure that long-term success. So how do we bake that into the system? Well, that's by pairing, individuals with an advocate, that individual can stay with them throughout the process. Because the reality is, as you go through these different systems, there's a lot of gaps in between them. I was just on a survivor call for the Sex Trade Survivor Caucus this morning, and one of our members was sharing that one of her clients that she's serving in Las Vegas was in crisis because their pimp was just let out of jail. And on probation, although they had promised her, the system had told her, right, that we're going to keep you safe. But now here immediately she has to deal with the trauma of knowing not only is her trafficker out and free, but now basically she just poked the hornet's nest. And so now she really has to fear for her life. And that's the unfortunate truth a lot of times of what happens with the system. And so I think we've got to be a lot more intentional about spreading that model, that we can, stay in contact with that individual and keep providing them services, because no one entity has all the answers, right? Law enforcement isn't going to always be the answer. Social workers aren't always going to be the answer, but when we have these multidisciplinary teams and we have an individual that's paired with an advocate to help navigate all those systems, I think it does become a little bit, I would beg to hope that it does make success more likely.
Have you seen any specific challenges when it comes to multiple disciplines working together?
I've definitely seen some challenges with working with multidisciplinary teams. And I think it's when people choose to be siloed instead of actually coming to the table and working together. And this isn't done easily, right? When you think about what's at stake, organizations may think, and this might not be their dominant thought, but funding becomes an issue. How am I'm trying to get the same dollars in the same community that these other entities are getting. There's other things around, sometimes some of the problems for MDT teams. The other issue I've seen come up around MDT teams is when we haven't built that relationship together. And so we're really not working together. I guess that's kind of tied in to a degree, but where maybe an advocate has this feeling and sentiment of, wanting to protect the survivor at all costs, which sometimes might look like stiff-arming law enforcement. And so that can obviously be an issue and a challenge for law enforcement when it becomes, oh, this is my victim, right, that I'm protecting and helping. And so I've seen issues arise out of that. But I think there are a lot of MDT teams that have been in operation and that are kind of really well-oiled machines and really do have all the correct MOUs in place, so they can come together on their monthly or their weekly staffings and talk about these cases of these individuals that are being impacted in their region.
Right. And one of the things that I saw that was effective was when you would have members of different disciplines have those discussions before they actually had the case. So when issues would arise, you already discussed it. You kind of get an idea of what somebody's position might be, and at least you have a deeper understanding when you go in, and you're not learning everything also as like the crisis is unfolding in front of you. So really like getting in front of it and preparing and getting those relationships too is one of the things that I've seen that had been common in the successful multidisciplinary teams.
Yeah, it does take a lot of front end work, and it's really getting to know the people in your community that are providing the services and drawing the lines, those dotted lines that break everyone up because we're interconnected. And, what maybe somebody can provide transportation, right? Whereas another organization, they might not have funding for transportation to court or whatever it is, wherever the survivor needs to go. So I think we could do a lot more together when we do come to the table and really build relationship with each other instead of working in those silos and being more concerned about funding than you are about providing and the services and doing the work.
And there was something that you mentioned when you were giving us the breakdown of your story and how you were able to transition. You mentioned that you had $1 million of debt due to financial exploitation. And is that something that you find is common, that there is debt related to the exploitation as well?
100%. I mean, obviously, it's its very own type of trafficking, right? Debt bondage. So that's a different area. But I do find it common among sex trafficking victims that their identities are used, right? Often we're given fake identities, as I was. My second trafficker that I wound up staying with for 10 years, he knew how to evade detection, and so he knew that he didn't work a regular job. So he didn't put any of the houses, the cars, that any of the large purchases went in all of the victims' names. And it was sold to us as a rite of passage. It was sold to us as, oh, look, he's going to put a house in your name and a car in your name because you've been down long enough and you've been around and he trusts you enough that now it's time to build up your credit, which was, sounded good while I was trapped, right? While I was in the game. And obviously, I didn't really have many choices at all. And so he wound up putting a $600,000 home that got foreclosed on in my name, two $80,000 cars that got repossessed in my name. While I was serving time in prison, he was getting credit cards in debt. I'm sorry, getting credit cards in my name and racking those up. So I left owing about $50,000 in credit card debt. And then even to add insult to injury, once for me, I wasn't able to get away until the federal authorities became involved. I wound up serving 13 months in federal prison because I took a plea deal for conspiracy to commit tax evasion. I was terrified. I believed my pimp when he told me he would kill me if I ever snitched on him or left him. And so, unfortunately, I took that charge. And when I got out of prison, he also forced me to go back and file all my back taxes so the feds would never come after us again, he said. Again, I didn't have choices. This is just something he forced us to go do, which meant I left owing the IRS $250,000. So traffickers will often intentionally put debt in victims' names because they know how much harder that makes it to get away, and not only to get away, but then to actually have a chance at a future doing something that doesn't revolve around your body.
With that experience, are you seeing now any systems that address that happens, when that happens, like either the financial exploitation or the damage to your credit, or is that still a gap that we might need to focus on for true support?
I think we're just now getting the legislative tools that we needed. The Debt Bondage Repair Act, DBRA, was passed in within the last couple of years. I want to say maybe 24 or 23. And that was a landmark piece of legislation that if you can get obviously an individual in order to be a recipient of the DBRA, they have to be able to prove their victim status as well as that the debt that they incurred was due to their trafficking experience. But if you're able to meet that threshold of proof, then they can go after the three big credit unions, which is Experian, Equifax, and TransUnion. And it doesn't remove the debt. It doesn't forgive the debt, but it does force those three big companies to stop reporting the debt, which means that it falls off of an individual's credit report. So while the debt could technically, that's kind of a legal loophole that we're waiting to see if it's going to be challenged or not, because technically that debt still exists and that individual could still be sued by those debtors if those companies wanted to come after them. But it's no longer allowed to be reported to the credit reporting agencies. And so I think that is the beginning, right, of a piece of legislation that we needed to be able to help survivors. But I think credit repair is a huge need as well. And I think it's interesting too, because, I think we kind of have touched on this, Miko, a couple of times, is like, there seems to be this period of when an individual does reach out for services that the services that they need are there for them. But then once they go past that period, right, what services are there for them still? And when I say that, I mean, say for in my example, I've been through obviously a horrendous amount of debt multiple times. Do you think that my financial future is perfectly solid just because I've right experienced that, and now I move through my restoration, and I'm doing well, and I'm out speaking and doing those things? And I think healing from being trafficked is a lifetime journey, which is riddled with issues that come up at a variety of times. I mean, we're not even talking the medical things, right? The psychological things, right? The emotional things, but then just also those other barriers that we're going to face for the rest of our lives. And I don't think we have enough services in support of survivors on that back end.
That piece also is one that's not addressed that much because it's, again, a little bit further removed from the crisis. And that's when you see sometimes the services um, become less and less and less as the further away you go from the crisis point. We do happen to have a question from our listening audience. For those of us in law enforcement, what steps can we take to maintain support for survivors during vulnerable periods without overstepping boundaries?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think for survivors, if you're going to be working with this population, um, you know, I think one of the highest energies that we can vibrate as human beings is authenticity. And as survivors, we know how to read people, and we know when you're being authentic or not. So I think number one is making sure that we're being authentic and building that just a true relationship with that individual. Because, and the other thing to really answer your questions is boundaries, right? Boundaries, 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 but with love, right? Boundaries with love, which is something that most survivors haven't experienced before, right? Because what traffickers offer is instant acceptance and love. And that feels really good to vulnerable kids and people that are starving for whatever it might be, whatever vulnerability factors that person's dealing with. My trafficker instantly accepted me, instantly gave me a place to stay, instantly told me how we're a team and look at this future that we're going to have, this dream that he sold me. And so when I come into services, if that's what I've had as like relationship, my main relationships, and I come into services and people have all these, rules and boundaries, or they come across as judgmental or inauthentic, that's probably going to make me not want to continue communicating with those people. The other thing I'd like to say is that, the reality is just because of being trafficked and the cycle of poverty and all the other different struggles that survivors and victims are going to experience as they try to navigate out, the likelihood of, like you said, turning back, Miko, right? That recidivism, going back to a life of exploitation, and or maybe it's not even rising to that level. Maybe it's just that you're constantly, still going through healing, and maybe you're still in a place where you're being drawn to toxic, negative people. And so you're still in negative cycles, even though it's maybe a little bit better, right? And for me,
Right.
that was the case for me. It wasn't that I instantly got better through some program. It was just failing one time after another, but each time I was failing a little bit better, if that makes sense, right? Like I was pulling myself out of the negative, toxic people a little by little. And so I think the reality is that long-term relationship has to be the goal. Right. And I think law enforcement, I know several law enforcement friends that come to mind that do that really well, both male and female. But it comes with having super strict boundaries and being extremely transparent. I think the top three tenets of being trauma informed are asking permission, providing choices, and being transparent. And if you could do those three things, right? I mean, as with a survivor, an individual that you may have this authentic, trust-based relationship with, they're probably going to try to push those boundaries at some time, whether they're meaning to or not. Just naturally, as needs come up and they continue to be in crisis, guess what? That's going to be felt by the people around them. But being transparent of like, hey, listen, I know you need to talk. I know you need to talk right now, but I can't X, Y, Z. This is when I can talk. Or, hey, I know you need help in this area. I can't do that right now, but let me connect you with someone that can. right? And so I think having your partners in place and it not just being all reliant on you, because that's, like I said earlier, it takes me back to that point of like no one entity or one person can be the be all end all. And so it's having your partners at the table, you continue building that relationship and being there as you can in appropriate ways for that individual. But then also referring them out, right? Like referring them, hey, I maybe they feel really comfortable with you, right? Because that sometimes can happen. There can be a deep bond that's formed, when you help someone, that they build a deep bond and feel a connection to you. And so I think that's really important to just make sure you have those other people in place so it doesn't become dependent on you, and that you're proactively being transparent about those boundaries and where they are, and you're saying them with as much love as you can, and compassion and grace as you can to that when you're expressing those boundaries.
Knowing that it's not, just as you described, not transactional. It really is that relationship. And it's the relationship with, the law enforcement officer in this question and the survivor, but also the relationship with the law enforcement officer and all the other community partners. Because those
Mhm.
boundaries, they will have, sometimes there will be an issue that falls outside the scope of what you do, and you have to have a way to be able, to handle that. So to have those partnerships in place is huge.
Yeah.
Now, Becca, before you leave us, we have a practice here. At the end of each episode, we give you 3 rapid fire questions. So we're at that place. So are you ready for that?
All right, I'm ready. Let's go.
Okay. Let's see. What's something that you have learned from a survivor that changed how you work?
Be true to yourself. It's easy when you're in that stage of trying to figure out who you are and who you're going to be from this point forward, and it's easy to look at other people and idolize them, maybe advocates, maybe people working at these agencies or organizations, and it's easy to put them up on a ladder as though like you want to emulate or have what they have, and I think that's um, detrimental. I think, staying true to who you are and being authentically you, whatever that looks like, so yeah, I guess that's like learning how to be authentically me, right, in public, and not hiding my past, has been really powerful for me, and I think I've only learned that through other survivor leaders.
Sometimes it's easier when you're in rooms you're comfortable in, but when you get to different spaces, to still remember that. That's hugely important. Okay, next question. What's one resource or tool that you would recommend to everybody in the field?
Ooh, okay. I'm gonna have to go with something I'm super passionate about right now, which is Mini. It's a brand new trauma therapy protocol. It's very similar to EMDR. Those that are familiar with EMDR, which is also known as eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, understand that you have to sit with the experience in order to heal from it. And MEMI is built on that same science. It's multi-channel eye movement integration is what MEMI stands for, MEMI. And MIMI is a lot more accessible than EMDR. There's a lot of reasons that survivors struggle with EMDR because it makes you go back and really relive the experience, every kind of instance of it. And sometimes as a survivor, it's like, first of all, there's so many experiences. How do you choose one, right? But then there's also this bilateral stimulation. Oftentimes you're encouraged to close your eyes and you have to watch this light go back and forth. And anyone that has done EMDR knows what I'm talking about. But it requires you to sit in the experience. And sometimes that's just intolerable for survivors for whatever reason. And so Mimi is really exciting to me. I'm actually working with HC Solutions now. I'm their director of business development and helping try to spread awareness of this new tool because it allows survivors or an individual receiving Mimi to just talk about the sensory components of the memory instead of the memory itself. And then we're able to heal that memory and push it back towards long-term memory where it should be, no longer affecting that individual and their daily decision making, right? Because those traumas and those things, those complex post-traumatic stress moments, right? They really shape the rest of our lives. It shapes how we make decisions on a daily basis, whether we realize it or not. And so I'm really excited to be able to help spread this new tool. And because individuals like that are working at safe houses, for instance, would be able to utilize this tool if they've been certified in it, not only LPCs. And so it's a lot more accessible, I think, for our population.
Wow, that's great. I had not heard of that. And then our final question. What is one sign of progress that you are seeing right now?
One sign of progress that I'm seeing right now is I think we are starting to see survivor leaders be in more positions of influence. Thankfully, across the country, I think we're not all the way there, but I was really encouraged lately to see a huge national organization with a big budget like Polaris put a survivor leader as their CEO. Survivors have so much more to offer than just their past experiences, and we bring a certain skill set, and so I think I think I've seen we're going in the right direction, and so that's my one positive thing.
Thank you. And I didn't know that information about Polaris either, so that is also good information to hear. Well, Becca, thank you for our discussion and for coming on today and sharing your experience and insight and parts of your story. Really appreciate everything that you shared with us and can help us understand how to help survivors overcome some of the challenges in the best way that we can. And I think the emphasis on is the long-standing part, so that economic empowerment piece that you brought in. So again, thank you so much for that. And then for our listeners, for you guys to remember that every system and interaction is an opportunity to show up. And as Becca would ask you to do, authentically show up. So whether you're an advocate or service provider, law enforcement, or an ally, your presence requires that if you make a difference, that it means that survivors will not be lost in transition and they will be supported and have lasting safety and recovery. And that's what the end game is. So again, thank you so much, Becca.
Yeah, thank you, Miko.
For more information about Equitas, go to equitasresource.org. That's AEQUITAS resource.org. Or follow us on Equitas_resource on Instagram. This series is executive produced by Jennifer Long, Miko Anderson, Equitas, and Robin Hopkins. Our production coordinator is Eleni Angeles, and the series is sound designed and edited by Brian J. Lighton.